Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. So, I know it was a lot on Wednesday and we have a lot to cover today. We probably won't get to cover the lymphatic system today, even though that's on the schedule, because we still have a lot to cover about how your blood vessels work. So, we know our heart is the pump that drives your blood flow and does a lot of the hard, like the majority of the lifting and generates the pressure within your blood vessels. But is that all there is to it? Do your blood vessels, are they just conduits for blood? Well, they can actually control the flow of blood, and we'll cover some of those ways their vessels can control the flow of blood today. All right, so let's go back to the capillary bed. So remember, capillaries are those important connections between your arteries and your veins, but they're more than that. They're in charge of slowing down the blood flow and branching out in these capillary beds to provide enough blood and perfusion and oxygen and nutrients to the tissues of your body. Now let's zoom in closer. Now remember, there are three main types of capillaries, and you notice like they all have different levels of how intact their overall vessel structure is. So continuous, they have the least amount of space between the endothelial cells that are inside the vessels. Whereas fenestrated, they have these little pukas, these little holes called fenestrations. And sinusoid, they're actually, and I think I may have made a mistake in a previous lecture, so they actually can allow certain cells to squeeze through these bigger gaps. So again, which is the most intact and sealed off, which is the biggest, is the most porous and the least continuous. All right, so now let's zoom in further. So now what we're looking at is a cross section, a little section of one of the capillaries, and what we see is that there are many things floating around in your blood plasma, including amino acids, proteins, glucose, water, ions, and they can travel through these little pores. And even like the continuous capillaries, they do have a little cleft between them. They're not completely sealed up like a tight junction. So what you have with these capillaries, they allow some things, like very small things, if in the case of a continuous capillary, and they allow a lot bigger things in the sinusoidal like capillaries. But what I'm getting at here is that you can push things from the blood plasma into the interstitial fluids surrounding tissues, or vice versa. So thing is that you have a pressure and this force called capillary hydrostatic pressure, or CHP for short. And notice the direction it's pushing. It's pushing from the blood plasma into the interstitial fluid. Now what we have here is a diagram, a very cartoony diagram of a capillary. And here we have our heart. Remember, our heart is that big pump and it's generating that blood pressure. So the heart is generating that pressure throughout your circulatory system, including your capillaries. So it's driving and pushing that blood through. Now, thing is that it's kind of like this hose right here. So what we have here, we have a hose and it has water pressure, right? Now, what if you've had like a poorly manufactured hose, or what if you have a hose and it's kind of old and you start to poke little holes in it? What would happen to those little holes as you put water through that hose? Well, if you have these little holes in your hose, and sometimes you might see this in gardening and irrigation, you start to spring these little leaks, right? So capillary hydrostatic pressure is kind of like that. It's that water pressure inside of your vessels instead of like a water pressure inside of a hose. So let's exaggerate these little pores between these endothelial cells in the capillary and make them a little bigger. So remember, you have your heart generating the pressure and generating the blood pressure by contracting and squeezing the blood through your circulatory system. So every time it squeezes, what is it going to do? Well, every time it does you have a little pressure from inside the capillaries, it's going to squeeze a little of this fluid outside. So every time you have this pressure, it's going to push some water out from the inside of the capillary toward the outside and into the interstitial fluids. All right, so what do we see here? Let's zoom in on this even closer. Now, again, we have that capillary hydrostatic pressure pushing fluid from the inside of the lumen of a capillary toward the outside interstitial fluid. So again, how does that happen? It happens by going through these little cracks between these endothelial cells that make up the inner lining of your capillaries. Now, capillary hydrostatic pressure, so this is what I like to think of it. It's the pressure that moves in general. Again, your heart is generating all that pressure. So it's the internal pressure that's pushing water and fluid from the inside of the vessel toward the outside of the vessel. In this case, we're talking about capillaries. So pushing from the inside toward the outside. Now, again, if this is a vessel, what we're going to see with capillary hydrostatic pressure, you have your blood pressure, and it's going to push against the walls, and by pushing against the walls, it's going to force fluid outside of your capillaries. And this is from the Martini version. I think the OpenStax version has one image kind of like this, but it's not as detailed. So what we're seeing here is arterial, and then we have a capillary connecting from the arterial to the venule. So remember, the capillaries are responsible for distributing and slowing down the blood flow and distributing oxygen and nutrients and collecting waste and byproducts from your tissues. Now, capillary hydrostatic pressure, again, when I talk about capillary hydrostatic pressure, it's a pressure that moves and forces liquid from the inside of a vessel toward the outside. So what we see here are capillary hydrostatic pressures going from the arterial side to the venule side. Now, this process is called filtration. So when you move the fluid from the inside of the vessel toward the outside and into the interstitial fluid surrounding these tissue cells, going this direction is called filtration, from the inside toward the outside. Now, that's why, in terms of filtration, you have from your capillaries alone, you have about 24 liters of fluid going from your capillaries to your interstitial fluid surrounding your tissues. Now, let's look at a cross section. So let's take another vessel and make little cross sections and look at what happens from the arterial side to the venule side. So remember, your heart is closer to the arterial side, so it's going to experience more pressure. And remember our previous analogy with the fire hydrant. As you travel further away from the heart, so when you go from arteries to arterioles to capillaries to venules to veins, the pressure drops off, right? So as the further you get away from the heart, the more your pressure drops off. So with more pressure, blood pressure, what's going to happen? More blood pressure results in more capillary hydrostatic pressure. And more capillary hydrostatic pressure, you have more fluid being forced from the inside of a vessel toward the outside. Now, again, remember that your blood pressure drops off as you get further and further away from the heart. So what happens to this capillary hydrostatic pressure is that as you go from the artery side toward the vein side, is that this CHP, this pressure, drops off. So as you go from the arterial side to the venule side, you'll force less and less water because this capillary hydrostatic pressure drops off. So again, this is an important concept, that the capillary hydrostatic pressure does not stay the same throughout a capillary. It actually tapers off the further you go from the arterial side to the venule side.